So, I completely spaced and realized that it wasn't up there when I was looking at Canvas this morning. But I will get the next homework. I've got it ready to go. I'll get that posted after class today. It should have covered everything that you need to kind of get through it. The due date will be 2 weeks from today, so you'll have a lot of time to work on it. But I will mention the next homework I might put out there like that second week when it's due. So like maybe that Wednesday you get the next one. So there'll be a little bit of overlap. So start working on it early, kind of trying to get that out of the way because it has been material that we've covered already. The further you get from it, the harder it's going to be to do that paper closer to the deadline. So, or paper, homework. I think there's only 3 of you that I haven't gotten data to that has some complicated ones. I'll send you all an email over the weekend with either a data set or a data set that will kind of work. But I think everybody else I should have gotten a data set to. So if you don't have it, like I said, there should be 3 of you that still need it. And we'll try to kind of start doing a little bit more work in Excel in class so you can kind of see how you work with that data. Okay. Anything other than that? Any questions before we keep moving? Also, next week is going to be a little bit weird for us. So I unfortunately will not be able to be here at all next week. So I've got some videos that I recorded that'll be kind of the next topics we're going to cover, which is primarily discrimination. Right? So we're talking about the labor market, we're doing wages. Next week, the videos I post will strictly be kind of discrimination in the labor market, right? And kind of how that works. So I'll have expected when we come back that following Monday, right? I should have these dates in my head, but it'll be what? 27th, that Monday, right? I'll expect you to kind of watch those and we'll kind of just continue to move on from there, right? So I'll get those out there this afternoon. Watch them whenever you want. Maybe it makes more sense to watch them towards the end of next week as opposed to the beginning. But yeah, that's kind of how I'll be replacing those classes with some videos on our YouTube playlist. And I'll put an announcement up on Canvas that has a link to it and kind of mentions all this as well. Okay. Any other questions for me before we jump back into material today? Okay. So we left off talking about free agency, right? So we're going to keep moving. We talk about some other things that impact the labor market, which are not team level kind of maximums, but if we set salary caps on individual player maximums. Right? So the NBA has some rules on this. So the collective bargaining agreement, this might have altered since the last one, but it's probably very similar. 49 to 51% of basketball-related income. That's the maximum that a player can receive, right? So they're kind of putting like whatever revenue you're generating, right? You can only give 50% or around 50% of it to that top player, right? So there is a player maximum in the NBA. There's also salary scales that are based off of experience. So, if I've got 2 years in the league versus 4, there might be a different maximum that's set for me. So what is that going to do? If the salary cap, the amount you can pay one player, is getting higher with more years of experience, what impact do you think that is going to have on rosters? If the cap is lower for younger players, what can I get away with doing? Paying a player less than what they're actually worth to my team. So we can kind of think about what this is going to look like. So if that's the case, that means I like younger players as opposed to older players, if that's the way that I set up my salary cap. So we can think about it. Markers are dying on me, so we're switching to green. Let's say I've got my demand curve for labor. I've got my supply curve. Right? When I'm setting a when I'm setting a salary maximum or a salary cap, what I'm really saying is, okay, look, in a perfectly free and open labor market, I would be paying you this higher wage. Right? The league will only let me pay you this lower wage, right? This is my, the equilibrium that I should be paying you is way past the point that the league is set, but they're saying I can't pay past that, right? So if I employ this individual at this lower wage, right, at my new equilibrium point, the value to the team, right, is going to be much greater than what they're paying them. Under the free and open labor market, the amount I was paying them was exactly equal to their value, right? That's the idea of like a perfectly competitive labor market. If I set this salary cap, I'm kind of guaranteeing that for players who should have an equilibrium wage above that salary cap, I'm actually going to be net benefit. The teams are going to have a net benefit, right? So the teams love these salary caps. Players don't, right? It's going to lower their overall wage. It's going to help out the teams. Okay? Now, they may indirectly like it because what might the effect of a salary cap also do? If I can't spend as much, I can only pay a player X amount of dollars, it kind of show you, it negates the issue of large and small markets. So let's say this first was my small market. Here's my large market. What's the equilibrium wage that both teams are going to be paying? They can only go up to that salary cap, right? So if I've got, differences in my small, large market teams, or the large market teams would always be able to pay the highest player the most. This helps mitigate that a little bit, right? Because it's guaranteeing that there's no discrepancy in the wage that's going to be offered from small and large market because they're both going to hit that cap, right? So that could do what? Help improve competitive balance, boost everybody's demand, right? So it may not be that it's worse off for the players necessarily, because down the road it could have, increase the demand for the league, increasing demand for the league. Remember, our demand curve for labor is the marginal revenue per win times the number of additional wins. So if I can boost this by improving competitive balance, well, then maybe down the road, wages for players will be better. Right? Now, if I keep the cap there, it doesn't matter. But if I allow that cap to kind of move, right? And notice it wasn't a set number. This is a set percentage. So if I can improve competitive balance by setting these salary caps, and I can always pay a player 50% overall revenue, well, then this salary cap is going to be moving with that shift in demand as well. But I won't kind of push it that far. I was just kind of using this to kind of prove like this helps kind of mitigate these impacts. So we've got these salary caps, right? Oops, there we go. If I described that we raise them for experience, that would predict that we like to get these players when they're young, where we can pay them kind of these lower salary cap, or these high quality players where they're going to be paid the maximum that they can be paid. NHL has kind of similar rules, although the percentages are much lower. So you can kind of think about it's going to have really the same impacts. I'm just mentioning both the leagues here. NFL has some interesting things we can think about in terms of the salary cap. So there's no individual salary limits, right? So for really high quality players, what's that going to do? It's going to guarantee that we have those really high wages, right? So you can pay technically in the NFL. There are salary caps for the maximum amount I can spend. But if I wanted to give of my 400 million or whatever it is I can spend, I could give all 399 million technically to one player, right? If I wanted to. Now that would be probably suboptimal because I wouldn't have enough talent in the rest of my team to make it worth that. But that would be the general idea. So one way that they kind of have found ways to get around the overall team salary cap is that signing bonuses don't if I give you a guaranteed signing bonus, it doesn't count against my cap, right? So, I said that backwards. If I give you a signing bonus, that does count against the cap unless I make that signing bonus contingent on performance, right? So they write if you get over 1,000 yards, or what is the example that I use here, leading the league in sacks, you get an additional $1 million. Well, if I end up having to pay you that, if I've written in that bonus tied to some performance measure, it doesn't count against the overall salary cap. Right? So you can kind of imagine, teams really like this, right? So they'd much more prefer to have these performance-based bonuses as opposed to just kind of regular guaranteed. But for players, which one do they probably like more? Probably the guaranteed money. They don't care about. I guess maybe they care about the cap in the sense of they might want to win, right? But if we're just strictly talking about kind of money, right, the salary they earn, they would prefer these signing bonuses that weren't tied to performance. So you can kind of see there's always going to be these things like that. what's good for the teams is often not good for the players, right? And so we kind of have this back and forth by negotiating what we want these different rules and terms to be.
Okay, but what's stopping these teams from like luring in like a sought after player, like let's say Odell, he's a free agent. Let's say some team wants him, but they have zero cap space, and so he's like, I want to get paid. What if they make the incentive? Okay, if you make one catch for 10 yards, I'll give you $10 million.
I don't know what the stipulations are on what the performance metrics have. My guess is there's probably like they have to be above the league average or something like that.
I know in NBA they have likely bonuses, so it's like if some measure you met before, it becomes a likely bonus.
So they build in like an expectation, multiplying it by the probability, and if it goes over a certain threshold, I'm guessing that they have some similar. Because you're right, if I didn't have any system, like I'll just make the performance really, really low, right? I don't know if they can technically. I haven't. That's a really good question. I should look into NFL, like figure out exactly what they're. If they have any rules at all about what those performance measures have to be. But you know, it's fine if I have the money, but even under that situation, let's say I make it so you have to 1 yard, I'm still having to pay you, right? So yeah, it doesn't count against the cap and I can spend more money elsewhere, but it's not as though like, if I guarantee that I'm giving you this money, maybe I also as a team like these performance because sometimes it doesn't happen, right? If I say that you even need 100 yards rushing, you get injured the first game, right? It doesn't matter how low it is. There's a probability that it doesn't happen. So the teams were always going to like having those higher performance measures just because the expected amount they'll pay out is going to get lower, right? But your point is taken, right? If I really just had all the money in the world and I'm just trying to get around this cap, I'll just make the performance measures really low. I would imagine that the league has something that protects against that. Any other questions? A good question. Any other questions for you? Okay. So we talked about this last class where we have strikes, lockouts, and bargaining, right? So we said strikes are when the players don't get what they want, and so they stop supplying labor. Lockout, teams don't get what they want, they stop producing the games, right? Or putting the product out there. And often we kind of have both of them going on at the same time, right? So talked about unions. I don't think we got to talking about salary arbitration. So why might, strikes and lockouts might occur if we don't agree the players union with the teams on certain things. We also have that maybe the teams and specific players, right, can't come to an agreement on their specific salary, right? So almost like a strike or a lockout just at the player level as opposed to the overall league. So what happens is, let's say that there's a dispute between a player and a team and something about their contract. We've got, we see systems used in professional sports, which is this arbitration, right? So there's some type of a disagreement. We need to go to a third party, right? Because we're not able to kind of come to an agreement on our own. I want this higher wage, you want this, to pay me this lower amount. Where are we going to, where are we going to result? Where's the end result going to be? So binding arbitration is when you say, hey, look, we can't come to an agreement. We're going to use this third party. Whatever decision they come up with, we both agree in advance to adhere to, right? So if it's a salary dispute and this third party says the amount paid should be $3 million, the team has to pay the $3 million, the player has to accept it, right? So that's binding arbitration. And we have that in Major League Baseball and the NHL, right? So if there's ever a salary dispute, they go to the third party that the MLB has, and then that person kind of makes their judgment, right? The NHL, the team and player submit proposals. It's a larger panel. I can't remember the exact number. And then they make a decision. And then Major League Baseball also kind of has this final offer arbitration, which is the arbiter can't say, let's say the player wants $3 million in this salary dispute. The team only wants to pay $2 million. The third party can't say, well, I'll split the difference. He has to say either $2 million or $3 million, right? So whatever proposal you push to this arbiter, it has to be realistic. Because, for instance, if a player, puts in that they think they should be paid $400 million, and the team says we only want to pay you $50 million. Well, the arbiter's going to look like, man, $400 million. No one else in the league makes close to that. So if I have to choose between one of those two options, yeah, the $50 million is probably a little bit too low, but this other offer that the player said he should be doesn't make sense, right? So what is there an incentive to do? Not be outrageous, right? To actually propose something that is a high probability of being accepted. So with this final arbitration where the third party can't choose like a middle value, you get parties submitting much more reasonable, right? They're a lot closer than if we didn't have this final arbitration. So if they can't impose they can't split the difference, what have we seen play out? And I'll go through an example of this. We can go through in a second. But we had, I think it was like two years I grabbed from Major League Baseball. There was 78 players that kind of it came out like that. That's all public knowledge now that they went to the arbiter. So sorry, there was 78 that were filed, but only 6 of them went to arbitration, right? 4 of the 6 lost. So let's think about why this is the case. So 78 players filed, but 6 only actually got a decision, right? So what's probably true about the other 72? Why did they not go to the full arbitration? They just filed, but then before it went to arbitration, they came to an agreement, right? So it's likely just filing, these players just filing them out, the teams have to be a little bit more like, oh, well, if we were trying to underpay you, maybe we'll give, if it's going to go to arbitration, maybe we'll actually be honest with you now and then just tell you, you should be paid a little bit higher. Yeah.
Is arbitration only a 1-year deal, right? So they can't just or if a player like request more money, they can just get underpaid for multiple years. Or
so if they want more money, I think because contracts are written, even if it was more than 1 year, because you have a final, a total amount written, I'm guessing they could. I'm pretty sure they can dispute any length of a contract. Okay, it wouldn't be like a per year, it'd be like a total amount of the contract.
Yeah.
I'm not a lawyer, so when it comes to like player contracts, I like say things with a grain of salt because I think this is how it works from my business law and classes I've taken, but I'm not an expert. But yeah, these 72 that didn't end up going to arbitration must have been because then the teams had to make more realistic offers, right? And they were starting to get afraid that the arbiter might go against them. So 72 of them, just by filing, the players kind of can put a little bit more pressure on the teams. Now, of the remaining 6 that went, well, it's probably players that, these 6 teams probably tried to resolve it for arbitration too, but the players just weren't budging. So that's why when it finally goes to arbitration, we actually see often the arbiter sides of the teams, right? I think, why does he say then, based off of this, the players losing, why did the guy who started the players even say final offer arbitration has been like the best thing for player salaries? Well, because it doesn't have to go to arbitration for it to impact the wages that teams are offering, right? And even the threat of filing for arbitration probably causes the wages, in different negotiations to be a little bit higher, even before it gets to that level. So one thing we can kind of think about, actually, do I have an example set up instead of just coming one off the top of my head? I think I actually have some slides here. Let's see. Let's skip ahead. Here we go. So we're going to talk about contract zones. So I'll come back to this, but I want to give you an example first. So let's say, and actually I'm going to use 2 different colors here. So let's say that we've got the teams, right? And they be willing to pay a player up to $10 million. Bottom is 0, right? They'd love to pay him 0, right? But any value in this range, if the value to the team, you almost think about this as this is the value of the marginal wins coming from labor. If the value of the team is 10 million, they'd be willing to pay the player anything up to 10 million, and they'd still be like net benefit positive. Now the player, we'll think about it. Let's say they'd be willing to play for 5 million, and I guess technically this is right anything above that, right? Or I guess whatever the salary cap in the league was, or if it's not there, just to infinity, right? So any wage proposed in this range, both parties are going to be okay with, right? So if we had this scenario, the contract zones for both parties overlap, we'll eventually come to an agreement, right? Now, to complicate this, right? Maybe the teams have a little bit more power than the union. The union has a little bit more power. Maybe we end up closer to 5 million, but we know we're somewhere in this range. A deal will be met. The problem is, what if I've got a very, what do we want to do first? Let's say we have a very pessimistic view of the player in question, right? And that the teams believe that actually, I'll keep this here. So the teams believe that this player actually isn't going to take anything less than 15 million. Well, now going into kind of contract negotiations with this player, the team thinks that we're way off, right? So this kind of, see if I can spell this right, pessimism, something like that. I'm not great at spelling. So pessimism, right? I had worse beliefs about what the player would be willing to accept. That pessimism led to, not really a lockout here, but I guess team doesn't really enter negotiation with the player, right? If they had the correct belief, they would have said, well, look, we know actually there's a pretty wide range of values that, we can kind of go back and forth with this player on that we know he would be willing to take. But if I have these pessimistic views, I don't even start the conversation because I say, well, what's the point? I know that I'm never going to pay more than 10 million. So if I think they won't take anything less than 15, negotiations don't even start. Right? What could happen if I have extreme optimism, right? So let's say I think that the player actually, marker is dying on me. I'll use red again, but. So what if I think that they'll actually take anything more than 2.5, right? Well, now a problem could occur, right? So here, I'm no longer pessimistic. Spelling it phonetically if it's not right. So we've got optimism. I think the player is actually going to take a lower amount. So the teams are optimistic about what the player will accept. What if they offer 3 million to this player? What's the player actually going to do? Reject that offer, right? So optimism by the teams could lead to players rejecting the offer that the team makes. Okay? So now I didn't draw it, but like if we ever started out where there was no overlap, then we won't get a negotiation either. But it's more interesting to kind of think about when we have two parties that could come to an agreement. Optimism and pessimism can sometimes lead to that agreement not being made, right? Now, obviously, this is like not a one-time play game, but they could have offered 3 million here, player rejects, they come back with another offer because they're like, oh, well, maybe I was a little too optimistic, right? But it's still going to cause the negotiation to go on longer. Even if it still does occur, on the 5th or 6th offer, it's going to make it go a longer number of back and forths. So this is kind of how we try to pick contract zones, thinking about whether or not things are, optimistic and pessimistic views. You could also think about how this plays out in things other than wages, right? So I kind of had this idea of like final offer arbitration and kind of the players and the teams going through salaries. But let's say it's interactions with the union and the league as a whole, right? So which could be something like, let's say teams really want a pretty high number of games. So they want a number of games somewhere in between 16 and, 22. Because they don't want there to be too many games because that starts to dilute the product, right? So this is kind of like green is like, here's my team. This is the number of games when they're dealing with the union that they could come to an agreement. This is how many games you want to play this year. The union might say, well, look, we actually prefer for player safety, right? We don't really want there to be too many games. So maybe this is like they want something between 12 and maybe they'll go up to 18, right? Because they don't want to do too many games in the season. That's actually not as, puts the players at risk, kind of makes their careers last a short amount of time. So the overall amount of money they make is less. So maybe this is like our contract zone for the teams and the union on the number of games to play in the season. So we know that the number of games, if just everything was perfect, like they neither one's optimistic or pessimistic. The number of games played will be somewhere between 16 and 18. Right? But what if going into the negotiations with the union, the team thinks that the union's really ridiculous and that they want to shorten the season from 12 to 14, right? So the team now is kind of pessimistic. So just like before, if the teams or the league is pessimistic about the union, what potentially could happen? Well, if they think that they won't take anything less than 12, they don't even enter the negotiation, contract negotiations, and the teams actually say, well, we're not going to play this season until you agree to a higher amount. Now, hopefully very quickly, like that pessimism is met by the union saying, well, no, we played 17 games, and then, hopefully then the team go, oh, we were being pessimistic about your views. We actually can come to an agreement, right? But it's at least going to make it take longer, right? It could cause an initial lockout. You could also have them being optimistic about what the play. So maybe they're like, oh yeah, these players, they should want to play for as many games as possible because they can you give them higher salaries, I'm in love with the game, whatever the reason they are, very optimistic that they're actually a lot closer to what the leagues want, right? So now what could happen is the team says, okay, look, let's propose 21 games, but this optimistic proposal, the players say, well, no, we're only willing to play up to 18. So we're going to go on strike, right? So it could be the pessimism leads to negotiations not initially occurring, and then optimism potentially put up offers that are then rejected, and we get the result of the players, there's a strike. And this could work the other direction as well, like where the players are optimistic, they propose a number of games that's too low, right? So maybe they think, if the players have incorrect beliefs and think that they'll take anything from 13, 18, maybe they propose 14 games. Well, the teams aren't going to accept that. Now the proposal from the union caused a lockout, right? So just you can work in either direction. I kind of just, did the pessimism and optimism by the team, but you could have pessimism and optimism by the players union as well. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Okay with that? All right. So what did I skip here? Let's go back. Oops. So this idea of strikes and lockouts, we've had plenty of examples across every sport where we've had lockouts or strikes. And the interesting thing is, if we actually had two sides that can't come to an agreement, what should be true is they'll never come to an agreement, right? Like if this is, the players union and this is the teams, there's no thing that will work for either one. We should see that there's never an outcome where they agree on or come to an agreement. What's probably true is there is an overlap and they're just trying to haggle to get closer to the end that they would want, right? Whether or not that's, depending on the league wants something higher or the union wants something lower. There probably is an overlap. And that's kind of played out in the fact that every time we've had a lock or strikeout, it eventually gets resolved, right? So it's probably that, it's not that there was no overlap in their contract zone. One side was being overly optimistic, one side was being overly pessimistic, or they were just kind of bartering in that range, trying to get theirs, a little bit closer to their desired style. So what would be the major negative impact if we do have a strike or a lockout? Well, potentially that's going to lower overall revenue, right, for the league. In the labor market, if there's lower overall marginal revenue, what happens to the demand curve for labor? So we said, I had it written out somewhere earlier. If the demand curve for labor is based off the marginal revenue per win, we go on a strike or a lockout, marginal revenue per win falls, what will we predict happens? The demand curve should decrease, lowering overall wages, right? So it's a dangerous game, for players to play as well. Like you might initially think, well, yeah, who cares? Strikes or lockouts, it hurts these billionaires who own the teams, right? But if it hurts the billionaires, if it lowers overall revenue for them, that's going to play out in lowering overall salaries for players as well. All right, so it's bad for both parties if we ever end up in one of those scenarios. All right, so, oops, went through the contract zone. So we talked about pessimism, optimism. These threat points, these are kind of like where my beginning and my end of what I'm willing to accept. With the wages one, it's kind of like open-ended, like it's here's my threat point, I take anything below it. Here's my threat point, I do anything above it. But yeah, that's in general, that's what we would call those kind of points, or just threat points. It's just kind of definitional. I already worked through an example, so you saw how that worked out. Another good example of this, and this is just kind of an interesting case studies, I guess, so to speak. So what was the year? Was it 2011 was prior to a collective bargaining agreement. And then in 2015, this is kind of data from after that. So there was no rookie maximum, or it was insanely high, but I mean, they were giving away like Sam Bradford got ridiculous first-year contract, like per season, he was getting paid, I guess, like 14 million, which doesn't sound like a lot relative to like quarterbacks now, but like coming out of the year, those were huge deals. So the league actually wasn't the one that proposed that we have a rookie pay scale. Right? So it seems kind of odd because you think the players would really like this, right? But why? Who's in the players' union? Are rookies and undrafted college students in the players? No, right? If teams are paying these ridiculously high salaries to rookies who might not even pan out, right? I mean, I would argue Sam Bradford had a terrible NFL career, right? And so all this money, well, who's no longer getting it? If they're giving all this money to these rookies, there's less money available for other people on the team. So the players' union is the current players, so they don't like high rookie, it's not going to impact them anymore. They're already on their rookie contract, right? So the players' union is actually the one who proposed that we set a rookie maximum. Intuitively would think, oh yeah, the teams would want to pay less, right? But the teams are paying that much because the expected value of that pick is a high amount of money, right? They're paying exactly what it'd be worth to them. The union is the one that says, well, no, we want more of that money to not go to rookies, so there's more you're going to give to the rest of us. So after they put this collective bargaining agreement in, when they had a rookie scale, you can just kind of see the difference in the lines, right? You get a much kind of lower amount given to rookies all around, which probably means there's more money available for the remaining players on the team. But yeah, they would negotiate, the league and the union could negotiate on this as well. We could do a contract zone for how high the league wants the rookie maximum to be, how high or how low, I guess we should say, the players union wants it to be, and kind of think about where do they come to an agreement somewhere in that range. So where are we at in time? Do a little bit more, and then I want to kind of go to that paper and bring some things up. So sure, hopefully you've heard this in another class, maybe not. But if I were going to give you $10 million today or $10 million next year, which one would you take? Yeah, why? What can I turn around and do? Throw it in like a CD that's guaranteed, and I'll have more than $10 million next year. So why wait for the 10 million when I can take it now and make even more, right? So this is the idea of kind of like net present value, and that every single additional year, we're actually we could invest it in getting whatever interest rate or return on investment, and I have more than $10 million the following year. Okay? So if I'm thinking about this, that means that today, that $10 million is only going to be worth tomorrow be divided by 1 plus that interest rate. So if I'm making a contract and I'm a player, when do I want most of my money in that contract to be? Let's say it's a 10-year contract. 1, 2, 3. The first couple of years, right? Because then I can invest it, right? Every single year, I'm losing out, like that amount of money is decreasing. Right? So players love to have front-loaded contracts, right? What would teams like? Yeah, they want to back it, right? They don't want to pay you for another 10 years because that same amount of money 10 years from now is worth much less, right? Also, you factor in, there's also expectations, at least in most leagues, like probably the NFL, that revenues are growing, right? So 10 years, I'll have even more money as well. So not only will it be worth less in 10 years, I'll also have more revenue to be able to pay it off in 10 years. So This time value of money, we kind of see, once again, players and teams have opposing kind of incentives. Teams would like to put more of the money on the back end of the contract. Players are going to want more of it up front. How can I get it up front immediately? Signing bonuses, right? I'm getting it today. I don't have to spread it out over the next 5 years. Maybe why Lamar Jackson really wants like this big guaranteed contract, specifically if it's written that most of the money comes early in the contract. Right? Sometimes teams get in trouble doing this. Like they, who was it? The Mets paid Bobby Bonilla, I think, $1 million, signed him to a $25 million contract for 25 years. So this was like as he was retiring. They like just gave him. They knew he was going to be around for like 1 more year, but instead of paying him $25 million for that 1 year, they said we'll pay you. Or maybe they would have only had to, maybe they would have paid like 20 million then. Like, we'll give you 25 over the next 25 years, right? So the teams, by the time of 25 years, that $1 million is so discounted. It was like a great deal for the team. I would argue whoever told Bobby Bonilla to do it was not a great idea. Other than, I guess, lifestyle, like it's easy to just live on a fixed income as opposed to some athletes, you get a bunch of money at once, you might spend it too quick and it's not there in 25 years, right? So there could be you could argue that that's a benefit. But really, he made overall way less money by signing that contract as opposed to if he had done a 1 year, $20 million contract even.
Would you say that like the dollar amount is worth more today than it was 25 years ago? So he's making significantly more than he would have, like
the dollar,
like with inflation and everything.
Or... well, that's part of the idea, right?
Yeah.
If I don't invest that money, that same dollar today is worth less in the future. Okay, yeah. So you're just working the opposite. Yeah, you're working in the opposite direction. Okay. Yep. Yeah, that's why it's like so bad, right? 25 years from there. Now that $1 million he's getting in 1995, it ain't going to go near as far as it would have in 1975, right? Yeah. Any questions on that for you? All right, so I'm going to jump to the paper here. I think I've got it mentioned. I've got some other slides that I'll go through later on. I have this slide that kind of references it, but I actually wanted to set this up and kind of get this question out of the way before we actually look at the paper. So if you even glanced at this paper, even when you read the abstract, it shouldn't be too bad, I don't think. So what was the main dependent variable they were looking at, right? So is it change in salary, change in GPA, change in credits taken, or change in number of points, right? So give you guys a little minute or so to kind of think about that. Kind of come together, talk about paper. So which of the main dependent variables was used, or the Y or the left-hand side variable, right? What we're trying to predict. All right, if you haven't gotten a guess in, take your best guess here. I think I counted 16, but it might have been 15. All right, there we go. All right. So what was the kind of main question of this paper was, we just looked at the title even, I think. Do high school athletes get better grades during the offseason? So what are we trying? We're trying to say, okay, how does athletic participation impact students' grades? So if you just had to guess, GPA, credits taken, salary, or points, which of those are probably the dependent variable? GPA. We're looking at performance, okay? Academic performance. So let's scroll down here. They got a bunch of summary statistics. And they kind of look at, okay, what are these impacts? Just a very naive regression of just these controls, and my dependent variable is GPA. So the regression equation we're thinking about here is what's the player's GPA, whether or not they were a student athlete, right? And then control for these other things, like were they male, senior, junior, whatever it was, right? So this variable is just a 1, 0. So a 1 unit increase in this X variable means going from not being a student athlete to being a student athlete, would predict that my GPA changes by whatever that coefficient is. So if we looked at their results, they're predicting that being a student athlete really boosts GPAs, right? So we can think of a bunch of different stories. These are high school, so I mean, I don't know, maybe some of the teachers are just more likely to pass the star quarterback. Maybe there's an added incentive, like they have to stay academically eligible. If they're a student athlete, maybe it's teaching them time management skills, right? So there's all these things that could be driving it. But I also am not including a lot of additional controls. So if I'm just looking at GPA in general, I might be getting, well, maybe it's that student athletes tend to, on average, be a little bit more academically involved and have higher GPAs to begin with. So instead of just looking at GPA, we're going to switch to looking at, I'm going to skip down here, changes in GPA, right? So instead of just looking at their GPA, we're going to control for, well, where did they start out last year? Right, that change in GPA, my GPA this semester minus the GPA from the previous semester. Now here, they also say, not only are you a student athlete, but they break it down by semester and say, is it the semester that you're currently playing as a student athlete? Because some people don't play in the fall, they play in the spring, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So we're breaking this down by semester and whether or not you are in season for your sport. And what they find is, if you look at the significant effect, that it looks like, yeah, there might be an increase in math GPAs. Right? But, we're still missing a lot of additional controls. So we'll skip down to even better. It says a lot of times how papers are built. You kind of start out and you kind of make your progressions better and better, right? You include more controls, you look at it a different way. So here we've got changes in GPA as well. Different ones like English, math, overall GPA. What's kind of interesting is, okay, let's split this up into whether or not there's an in-season effect for varsity players versus JV. Because maybe varsity is more intensive, right? There's a lot more practice hours, it takes a lot more of your time. And what's interesting here is the overall GPA, you see that being on varsity actually decreases your GPA, or your change is negative. While if you're on a JV team, it is teaching you things like, or incentivizing you to be academically eligible. It is incentivizing you, to learn time management skills, and you actually see that GPA go up for those JV players. So it's kind of interesting, but an overall effect, it looked like it was positive, but it's really being driven by the JV players, where the varsity players have the exact opposite impact, right? Any questions on that for keeping, and not everything is significant here for, like, if we break this down by math and English, but notice, I mean, they're kind of going in the same, like, either negative, this one's positive, positive, negative. So they're kind of telling the same story, even if they're not all significant, right? Questions on that before we keep moving here? All right, so we're then going to go even further, right? So I'm going to scroll down here. We're going to ignore all this, but this is good stuff. It's just we don't have the time to look at it. So here we're going to look at, they're going to go down here. I know it's somewhere down here. Yeah, so this is what I want. So they had this idea of, like, well, look, we really are trying to get at what the impact of being a student athlete is. But there's all kinds of selection. Like, if I'm a student athlete, like, maybe when I'm in season, I'm taking easier courses, right? Maybe when I'm in season, I'm taking fewer AP courses, right? So I want to start to control for all these other things that are likely also changing by the student athlete semester by semester, right? So if I can control for course ease, right? What was the change in course ease between the two semesters I'm comparing? What was the change in the total number of classes, the pass rate of those classes, whether or not they were, how many honors AP classes I took, the change in that, change in college, core, number of subjects. They really try to throw at, like, the kitchen sink at this, right? Control for as many other things that could be changing about their academic experience in those semesters. And when I'm controlling for all those factors, it's like the same two students, both of them have the same change in the number of core courses, same change in college classes, same change in the pass rate of the classes they take. Everything's identical. But one of those students is a varsity athlete, the other's not. And they're in season. In season varsity athlete, the other's not. We would predict their GPA goes down by about 0.02, which might seem like a ton, but I mean, we're on a 0 to 4 scale there. It's not the smallest thing in the world. Also, we've got, holding all that constant, we still find that the JV players are seeing this positive effect. Okay? So what might the predictions be from here? Probably getting students involved in sport is good for teaching them things like time management, maybe potentially creating incentives. But when that sport becomes too time intensive, right, all those positive benefits are kind of outweighed by the fact that I just don't have as much time to devote to my, studying for a test or something like that. So I thought it was kind of interesting. And kind of the same idea. Not everything is significant when we break this down by like math and English, but all the signs are kind of still the same, and we're getting kind of similar estimates there. Right? Any questions on that idea? So I don't know. I thought it was kind of an interesting paper. It does some complicated stuff in the middle we don't have to worry too much about. Just kind of looking at these main kind of specifications. So what I am going to do is go over something before we leave, but we've already got that again. So I want to mention this before I go over the lesson. So I'll get that video posted, 2 videos posted up. One of them will be me kind of working through an example in Excel, and the other will be kind of that discrimination stuff, the next topic, which was discrimination that's existing. But I do want to go through because I think it's interesting. So if I have, here we go. So March Madness right now, first of all, I'm sure everybody, I'm sure I'm going to lose time on that. But it's interesting. I saw and heard someone saying that this morning, again, like, 0.003% of brackets are still perfect. So if you want to think about what's the probability you actually pick a perfect bracket, we can do kind of this crazy thing, right? How many combinations could I make of these 63 games in the tournament, right? So if there's 2 choices for every single one, I could choose one team or the other, right? There's 2 choices for every game. Then I would have 63 games. It would be 2 times 2, or 2 times 2, 2 to the 63rd power. That's how many possible brackets I could fill out, right? So what's the probability that one of those is correct? Well, only one of them is going to be right. Only one of them will be perfect. You're like, well, I don't even know what that number is. I have 1 over something outrageous, right? This is worse than the lottery. You look at the odds for the lottery, it's way better, right? Now, obviously, if you're talking about like winning a pool, it's different because it's relative. But in terms of just getting every single game right, there's no chance. I mean, that's almost impossible, right? So if it does happen, it's like, well, like I said, it's crazier than winning the lottery. Now, obviously, every game, it's not that each team is equally as likely. So if I'm trying to I'm not just going to choose one of the 2 teams. The probability this team wins is 80%, but I can factor in those probabilities. So instead of like 0.5 times 0.5, that could be 0.8 times 0.76 times 0.54, right? Whatever the probabilities are, or predicted probability of that team winning. So someone actually did this work, and you're still at what, 1 over 128 billion, right? So I mean, yeah, even if you factor in, you get all these predictions for the probability of the team winning, you get them exactly right, and based on that, you still have a really, really slim chance of it picking it perfect. Wow, kind of interesting to think about. I was actually thinking about this too. Just some things we talked about. So there was like some big upsets, right, in round 1. Why do you think, what would be a positive for the NCAA? Why do they like first round upsets of like 1s versus 16s or 2 versus 15s? What people watch next year or the next game? What happens? I now think that going into it, 116, I'm like, yeah, there's no, I know the outcome. I don't want to watch that game. What's the other game that's on right now, right? But if I start seeing more upsets in those, competitive balance essentially is improving. We know that it drives fan demand, right? Now, why might I not like it? Some of those schools that win who are smaller seeds are in much smaller markets, right? They have a much smaller fan base. They're not going to bring as much additional revenue kind of down. If Duke makes it to the Final Four, it's probably a lot more additional revenue than Furman. Although, I don't know, maybe it's like Wichita State. Like I felt like there was a period of time where like everybody was buying Wichita and becoming a fan, right? So maybe the fan base grows as a result of it as well, and you get even more improved competitive balance down the road. So I don't know. I think about these things sometimes. So I just thought I'd bring that up since it's somewhat relevant. I'll get that homework up there and the videos that kind of replace next week. I will see you guys on that following Monday and kind of pick up where those videos leave off. Okay.